Hi, good morning. This video is for my individual assignment of the issues in economic analysis. My name is Wu Danny and my matric number is 170036. My presentation is about the case of the United States. As we all know that there are many concerns of the economic issues of the United States, since it is one of the biggest powerhouses in the world. The economic growth issues in the United States has a wide-ranging effect to the worldwide. So this topic is very interesting and a little complicated. More details will be shown in my PowerPoint. Now let's go to my PowerPoint. As you can see, this is my contents. It is divided into 4 parts. The first one is the current scenario in the US, and I choose 2 issues. The first one is the tax cuts and the public debt. From my own perspective, I think the capital accumulation is very important for a country's economic growth. But the key point of the long-term economic growth is the human capital factors. So the second issue, I choose the education and human capital, this issue, and the last part is the brief conclusion and the outlook from my own perspective. Alright, now let's go to the part 1. The part 1 is the current scenario in the US. It contains the GDP growth rate, the export, the consumption, and the investment are 3 main motivations for a country's economic. As you can see from this chart, it is very clearly to say that because of the financial crisis in 2008, it has cast a cloud on American economy. Even though in one or 2 years later, the United States has already been into a recovery, but it cannot come back to the previous booming upturns. It's almost below 3%. On the other hand, according to the World Economic Outlook, it predicts that the growth will be dropped in 2 years later. Alright, this chart is about the export and the import of the US. We know that Trump in the last year, he declared trade war to China, Canada, Japan, and other trading partners to reduce the US export and import deficit. From my own perspective, I think it is more negative for the long-term economic growth. The next is the consumption. Consumption is always connected with the tax cuts. We know that the tax cuts can be regarded as a kind of physical policies. But the physical policy just focus on the short-run economic growth. So for a long run, the impact of tax cuts could gradually decrease in the long run. Furthermore, because of the trade war, this will lead to a higher consumption cost and lead to a lower domestic consumption in the US. And the investment is always related to the interest rate. From this chart, as we can see, it is very clearly to say that in 2017, the interest rate is just only 1.25. It has doubled to 2.5% in 2018. Just more than 1 year, we can say the interest rate is higher and higher, which is bad for the investment. The investment will shrink. So, based on the current scenario of the U.S., some researchers they put forward there are two challenges for the United States. The first one is to overcome the tepid pace of the cyclical expansion since the financial crisis, and the second one is to raise the potential long-term growth of the GDP. There are many issues in the United States, and I choose two issues. The first one is the tax cuts and the public debt. This is a brief introduction about the tax cuts. The time is 2017. The United States government implemented the large-scale tax cuts, which includes the individual income tax reduction and also the corporate income tax reduction. Both of them focus on the reducing the income tax rate, and the last one is the reform of the overseas income tax system. We know that the tax cuts can stimulate consumer demand as well as the corporate investment demand. We can say this chart from the World Bank Group report. Because of the tax cut, the domestic demand and the investment in the U.S. shows a upward trend. And also the U.S. government minister, it also predicted that the economic growth rate of the U.S. will reach 2.9% in the next 10 years, and among this 0.5% is leased from the stimulating effect of the tax cuts. However, not all the tax cuts is good for the development of the economy, because the tax is the primary source of the government revenue. It will lead to a higher and higher debt, which the government have to form the higher and higher interest spending of the debt. This slide is the brief introduction about the American public debt issues. Firstly, I want to say the standard of the public debt. It should not more than 60% of GDP, and the physical deficit rate should be lower than 3%. To be more specific, data. Now the U.S. government has increased 1 trillion in debt over the past 11 months, and the public debt quickly broke through 22 trillion dollars. And what's more, in the next 10 years, the tax cut will increase the anticipated deficit by $1.23 trillion. And even though in the next 20 years, the federal budget deficit will increase by 70%. To compare with another country, we can say from this chart from the IMF, we can say that according to IMF, the proportion of U.S. public debt to the GDP has already increased by 1.46 times during that period, which is higher than Japan, Singapore, Italy, and Belgium. The public debt and economic growth is controversial for a long time. Some scholars they think that actually the government debt plays a significant role to promote economic growth through the investment, because the government can use the funds to increase spending, so that to stimulate the total demand. But more and more researchers they agree another point is that a heavier public debt will cause less national net savings and lead to a higher interest rates, so that the private investment will be squeezed out, because the public debt we can say is a kind of liability, so it is more difficult for government to fund future essential investment projects. Based on this scenario, I put forward two policy suggestions. The first one is to broaden the capital accumulation. This is related to the economic growth, because it is the most fundamental solution. So how to improve the economic growth? The driving force is depends on the technology, the innovation, the demographic dividend, and the second one is to economize the expenditure and maximize utility, such as to invest the long-term infrastructure. This is not only can promote the public demand investment, but also it is good for the social demands. Okay, the next issue is the education and the human capital. This slide is about the theory about the human capital can boost the economic growth. I choose the most famous one is the Roma and the Lucas. The Roma he believes that one of the main drivers of economic growth and increasing returns to scale is the accumulation and the spillover of expertise. Based on his model, he divides the social economy into three parts: the R&D, the research and design department, and the intermediate production department, and the final production department. He proves that R&D department actually promotes technology progress through the human capital investment, and the technology advancement determines the investment of capital. Correspondingly, the increasing in human capital in R&D department can bring about gradual increase in the number of products. So he think that the vital role of human capital investments in the process of the economic growth. Lucas totally agree with this, and in addition, he provides that the human capital is showing a strong externalities. That means that the higher productivity of a worker, the smarter the people around him will be. Also, there are many scholars, they use the empirical studies to learn why the United States can quickly become the most massive powerhouses in the world, because according to their results, we can say because the United States owns a large number of scientists, the technology experts, and the senior talents. So this is the reason why the United States is one of the biggest powerhouses in the world. We all know that the human capital is very significant to the country's economic growth, and one of the standards for measuring the human capital actually is the education. Now I put forward three problems of the United States. The first one is the expensive tuition. The educational minister say that now the annual tuition in the U.S. has been reached 5 figures, which means that not every children in the United States can afford the fees. The second one is the educational level. According to Zhang and Shang, their study, they say that nowadays the educational level in the U.S. has already been shows a decreasing tendency. And the last one is the plight of stagnation. Oh, there are more specific data. It is said that from the average of 3% in the 1970s to a yearly, and now in the early 21 century, there are less than 2% to contribute to economic growth. And according to OECD's, it predicts that the average annual growth rate of human capital will be less in later years. Well, based on these issues, I put forward three policy suggestions for this issue. The first one is to increase public education expenditure, such as to put more focus on the patent outputs, the management innovation, and the industrial upgrading, and so on. The next one is to improve the national education level. I think that it is better if the U.S. government can strengthen higher education to improve the quality of human capital, to improve the development of science and technology. And the last one is the innovation. Innovation is the key point. So the government should focus on the information technology and enhance human capital levels. The last part is a brief conclusion and the outlook. As I mentioned before, we can conclude that if we want to achieve the growth of wealth, the capital accumulation is very important, but the key point is the human capital factors such as the technology, the ideas, and these factors can achieve a long-term economic. About in terms of the outlook, I divided them into two parts. From the short term, I think the U.S. economic growth will be into a continued recovery because of its mailing policies. But for a long-term perspective, I think there are mailing problems and complicated issues in the United States. So there is a long way for United States to go. Alright, now thank you for your listening. This is end.